Welcome to a SCARS Institute audiobook written by Dr. Tim McGuinness. This audiobook, titled The First Deception, Adam and Eve in the Garden and the First Scam. It is published by the SCARS Institute to help scam victim survivors and their families and friends to better understand scams, victimization, and how normal people are lured in, then manipulated and controlled by scammers. Always remember, it was not your fault, and you are not alone. This SCARS Institute audiobook is copyright 2025 by the Society of Citizens Against Relationship Scams, Inc., a non-profit crime victims assistance, advocacy, services, and support and recovery program provider, educating scam victims around the world. This is from an article on the SCARS Institute's magazine scamsnow.com. Please take a moment to review all of our exceptional articles about scams, scam victims, and the challenges they face. And now, the first deception.
The First Deception. Adam and Eve in the Garden and the First Scam. The story of Adam and Eve in Genesis. A closer look at deception and scams and their consequences. Part 1. The story. The story of the first scam of Adam and Eve in the book of Genesis offers a timeless narrative of trust, deception, and the consequences of choices, with themes that resonate deeply if you've ever faced manipulation or betrayal. Found in Genesis chapters 2 and 3, this account details God's command not to eat from the forbidden tree, the serpent's cunning manipulation, and the far-reaching consequences of Adam and Eve's actions. By examining the actual text, you can see how this ancient parable or story mirrors the dynamics of a modern-day scam, revealing the emotional and spiritual fallout of deception. Let's look through the key passages from Genesis, focusing on God's message, the serpent's role, and the aftermath, while exploring how these elements can speak to your own experiences with trust and betrayal. Let's try to uncover the lessons in this for you. Our intention in this article is not to be religious, nor to promote faith, but to use a well-known parable to illustrate both that scams have been around since the beginning of human time, and that there are lessons everywhere that you can use to both better understand scams and fraud, as well as understand the terrible consequences that come from victimization. What is a parable? A parable is a short, simple story used to illustrate a moral or spiritual truth, often employing comparison or analogy to teach a lesson. It differs from fables in that it might not always have a stated moral or explicitly allegorical interpretation. Parables are frequently used in religious contexts, such as in the Bible, where Jesus used them to engage and challenge his audience. Important SCARS Institute note. The story of Adam and Eve, found in Genesis 2 and 3, was written thousands of years ago for an ancient audience with a distinct understanding of morality and human purpose, reflecting the cultural norms of that era. In those times, societal structures often placed men as dominant figures, with women like Eve depicted as secondary and more susceptible to temptation, as seen when she is deceived by the serpent with the words, "You will not die. For God knows that when you eat of it your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God." This portrayal aligns with historical views of women as needing guidance, a perspective that shaped the narrative's tone and implications. Additionally, the stories focus on obedience to divine authority and the severe consequences of disobedience, such as expulsion from Eden, mirrored the moral framework of a society that valued strict adherence to rules. We are using this ancient tale to illustrate a modern perspective on scams, focusing on its themes of trust, deception, and consequences, rather than its historical dynamics or moral teachings, to draw parallels to your own experiences with manipulation. Section 1. God's Command, the Boundary in Paradise. The story begins in Genesis 2, where God creates Adam and places him in the Garden of Eden, a perfect environment filled with abundance. God provides clear instructions about the trees in the garden, setting a boundary that will later become the focal point of the deception. The text in Genesis 2 verses 16 to 17, New Revised Standard Version, states, "And the Lord God commanded the man, 'You may freely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall die.'" For you, this command might feel like a moment of trust in a relationship or situation. Someone sets a clear rule for your safety, and you believe in their intentions. God's message to Adam is straightforward. You're free to enjoy everything in this paradise, such as with the internet. But there's one limit designed to protect you. The consequence of breaking this rule is severe, such as death, but the instruction is given in a context of love and provision, not restriction. Adam, and later Eve, who was created in Genesis 2 verse 22, are entrusted with this boundary, highlighting their role as stewards of the garden and their relationship with God. This trust sets the stage for the serpent's manipulation, as it exploits their innocence and curiosity, just like scammers often do. Section 2. The serpent's manipulation, a crafty deception. The deception unfolds in Genesis 3, where the serpent enters the scene and targets Eve with a calculated approach. The text introduces the serpent in Genesis 3 verse 1. Now the serpent was more crafty than any other wild animal that the Lord God had made. The serpent begins its manipulation with a seemingly innocent question that distorts God's command. He said to the woman, "Did God say, 'You shall not eat from any tree in the garden'?" Eve responds in Genesis 3 verses 2 to 3. The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden. But God said, 'You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, or you shall die.'" Notice how Eve adds to God's command. She says they're not even to touch the tree, which God didn't specify. This addition might reflect her uncertainty or an attempt to emphasize the boundary, but it gives the serpent an opening to exploit. The serpent directly contradicts God's warning in Genesis 3 verses 4 to 5. But the serpent said to the woman, "You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." For you, this moment might remind you of how a scammer operates, starting with a small distortion to create doubt, then offering a tempting promise. The serpent's words are a classic manipulation tactic, also often used by politicians. It undermines Eve's trust in God by suggesting he's withholding something desirable, appealing to her curiosity and desire for wisdom, much like a scammer who might promise wealth, love, or knowledge to lure you in. The serpent convinces Eve that the forbidden fruit will elevate her to a godlike status. This deception leads to the pivotal act that changes everything for Adam and Eve, setting the stage for the consequences that follow. Section 3. The act and immediate aftermath, a shift in awareness. Tempted by the serpent's words, Eve makes a choice that draws Adam into the deception as well. Genesis 3 verses 6 to 7 describes the act and its immediate impact. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. For you, this moment might echo the point where you are fully lured into a scam, perhaps sending money to a fraudster or sharing personal information, believing in their promises. Eve's decision is driven by the serpent's manipulation, but also by her own desires or needs. The fruit looks good, it's pleasing to the eye, and it promises wisdom, just like the fake face in a romance scam, or the promises of wealth in an investment scam. Adam, who is with her, eats as well, showing how deception can ripple through relationships, affecting more than just the initial target. The immediate consequence is a loss of innocence. They become aware of their nakedness, a symbol of vulnerability and shame, the first primeval shame, and they try to cover themselves, reflecting a newfound fear and self-consciousness. Was this denial? This shift in awareness is a powerful parallel to the emotional fallout you might experience after a scam. The realization that you've been deceived can bring a flood of shame and vulnerability, much like Adam and Eve's sudden need to hide their nakedness. They hear God walking in the garden in Genesis 3 verse 8, and their response is telling. And they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden at the time of the evening breeze, and the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. Very much like scam victims hide the fact that they were scammed. Their instinct to hide reflects the guilt and fear that often follow betrayal, emotions you might recognize if you've ever felt too ashamed to tell others about a scam. Section 4. God's confrontation and the consequences. God seeks out Adam and Eve, calling to them in Genesis 3 verse 9. But the Lord God called to the man, and said to him, "Where are you?" Adam responds in Genesis 3 verse 10. He said, "I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked, and I hid myself." God then questions them further, uncovering the truth of their actions. Adam shifts blame in Genesis 3 verse 12. The man said, "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me fruit from the tree and I ate." Eve, in turn, points to the serpent in Genesis 3 verse 13. Then the Lord God said to the woman, "What is this that you have done?" The woman said, "The serpent tricked me and I ate." This blame-shifting mirrors the confusion and defensiveness you might feel after a scam, as you try to make sense of what happened and who's responsible. God then pronounces consequences for all involved. To the serpent, in Genesis 3 verses 14 to 15, the Lord God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, cursed are you among all animals and among all wild creatures. Upon your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel." To Eve, in Genesis 3 verse 16, to the woman he said, "I will greatly increase your pangs in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children, yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." And to Adam, in Genesis 3 verses 17 to 19, and to the man he said, "Because you have listened to the voice of your wife, and have eaten of the tree about which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread until you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. You are dust, and to dust you shall return." These consequences are profound, altering the lives of Adam, Eve, and their descendants. For you, they might reflect the long-term impact of a scam, financial hardship, emotional pain, and a changed relationship with the world around you. The expulsion from Eden, described in Genesis 3 verses 23 to 24, marks the final consequence. Therefore the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden, to till the ground from which he was taken. He drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden he placed the cherubim, and a flaming sword, and who turned to guard the way to the tree of life. This banishment symbolizes a permanent loss of innocence and security, much like the loss of trust and stability you might feel after being deceived. Section 5. Reflections on Deception and Recovery. The story of Adam and Eve in Genesis highlights the anatomy of deception, a trusted boundary, a manipulator who exploits desire and doubt, and consequences that ripple far beyond the initial act. For you, this narrative can serve as a lens to understand your own experiences with scams. The serpent's tactics, distorting the truth, appealing to desire or needs, are the same strategies used by modern fraudsters, whether they're promising love, wealth, or security. The emotional fallout for Adam and Eve, marked by shame, fear, and blame, mirrors the feelings you grapple with after a scam, from self-doubt to a fractured sense of trust. Yet, the story also offers hope. Despite their expulsion, Adam and Eve continue their lives outside Eden, adapting to their new reality. For you, this can be a reminder that even after a betrayal, you can rebuild and grow. By learning to recognize the signs of manipulation, practicing self-compassion, and seeking support, you can navigate the consequences of deception and find a new sense of stability. The story of Adam and Eve is not just about a fall. It's about the resilience to rise again, a lesson you can carry forward in your own journey. Section 6. Lessons from Genesis for your journey. The story of Adam and Eve in Genesis 2 and 3 unfolds as a powerful narrative of deception, beginning with God's command not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You may freely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall die. The serpent, described as more crafty than any other wild animal, manipulates Eve by sowing doubt. Did God say, "You shall not eat from any tree in the garden?" and promising godlike knowledge, leading her and Adam to eat the fruit. Their act brings immediate shame, as the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and there would be severe consequences. God curses the serpent, increases Eve's pain in childbirth, and condemns Adam to toil before expelling them from Eden. For you, this story mirrors the dynamics of a scam, where trust is exploited, and the fallout, shame, fear, and loss can be devastating. Yet, it also offers hope. Just as Adam and Eve adapted to life outside Eden, you can recover from deception by learning discernment, embracing self-compassion, and rebuilding trust. This ancient tale reminds you that while deception can alter your path, it doesn't have to define your future. You have the strength to rise and thrive. Part 2. Analysis. The Garden Scam, a criminological analysis of Adam and Eve's deception. Here is an analytical breakdown of the biblical story of Adam and Eve, interpreted through the lens of scam victimology, criminology, and psychological manipulation. Section 1. Reframing Eden as a crime scene. At first glance, the story of Adam and Eve in Genesis might appear to be a foundational moral narrative about obedience and sin. But when examined through the lens of criminology and scam psychology, it takes on a distinctly different tone, that of a classic con. In this reinterpretation, the serpent functions not just as a symbol of temptation, but as a manipulator employing high-level scam tactics. Adam and Eve, in turn, become the first documented victims of a psychological scam, lured, deceived, and ultimately abandoned after the con succeeds. Section 2. The vulnerabilities of Adam and Eve. According to Genesis 2-3, Adam and Eve lived in a state of innocence and harmony. However, from a scam psychology perspective, this innocence also denotes vulnerability. They lacked prior exposure to deception, had no frame of reference for betrayal, and lived in an environment of total trust. These factors placed them in what criminologists call a high-trust, low-awareness state, a common target profile for confident scammers. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, often called Maslow's table of desires, helps us further understand this susceptibility. While Adam and Eve's physiological and safety needs were met, their psychological and self-fulfillment needs, especially those tied to knowledge, autonomy or agency and identity, remained fertile ground for manipulation. The serpent exploited these upper-tier desires, particularly the drive for self-actualization. You will be like God, knowing good and evil. This appeal to higher wisdom and empowerment bypassed their basic survival instincts and triggered their aspirational motivations. This is a technique used by politicians as well. Section 3. The Serpent's Technique. Psychological and neurological manipulation. The serpent's manipulation is precise and multi-layered. It begins with a gaslighting maneuver. Did God really say, "You must not eat from any tree in the garden"? Genesis 3 verse 1. This false premise introduces confusion and seeds doubt about the authority they trusted. This tactic mirrors the way scammers inject ambiguity to destabilize a victim's certainty and encourage engagement. Then the serpent undermines the consequences of non-compliance. You will not certainly die. This is classic minimization, downplaying the risk while overemphasizing the potential reward. The next statement appeals directly to identity and ego. For God knows that when you eat from it your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God. This is the bait, an offer of transformation, enlightenment, and empowerment. From a neurological standpoint, this moment triggers what is known as amygdala hijacking, a state where emotional processing overwhelms rational thought. The promise of godlike knowledge induces intense curiosity, desire, and hope, also known as magical thinking, overriding the caution and obedience that previously governed their behavior. Scam victims often describe this moment as a blur or a switch being flipped, rational objections suppressed by an overwhelming emotional surge. That's what the serpent triggered in Eve, and through her in Adam. Section 4. The execution of the scam. Once Eve accepts the fruit and gives it to Adam, the scam is complete. The act marks a sudden cognitive shift. They perceive their nakedness and vulnerability immediately, suggesting a traumatic emotional crash that often follows scam realization. In criminological terms, this is the post-fraud psychological collapse. The moment a victim understands the enormity of what has occurred and begins to internalize the perceived failure. At this point, the serpent vanishes from the story. There is no support, no explanation, no remorse, just abandonment. This reflects a common pattern in romance scams and investment frauds, often referred to as a rug pull. Once the criminal achieves their goal, they disappear, leaving the victim to face the fallout alone. The shame, self-blame, and isolation that follow are not just emotional consequences. They are direct outcomes of the manipulator's calculated exit. In other words, the intention of the scammer, even if they never gave it any thought. Section 5. The aftermath, victim blaming and exile. God's response in banishing Adam and Eve from the garden parallels what many modern victims experience: social exclusion, blame, and lack of institutional support. While the narrative paints this as divine justice, from a psychological standpoint, it can be interpreted as systemic failure. Instead of support, the victims are penalized. They lose their home, their safety, and their former identity. Scam victims today often face similar reactions. Friends and family who say, "You should have known better." Institutions that offer no restitution, and internal voices that echo their abuser's judgment. Section 6. Conclusion. Lessons from the first scam. The story of Adam and Eve, reinterpreted as a psychological scam, offers timeless insight into how manipulation operates at both individual and systemic levels. Their vulnerabilities, naivety, trust, and unfulfilled existential desires are the same ones exploited by scammers today. The serpent's techniques, such as gaslighting, minimizing risk, offering identity transformation, remain among the most powerful tools in the scammer's arsenal. Understanding this story through the lens of criminology and trauma psychology doesn't diminish its spiritual significance. It enhances its relevance. It reminds us that deception is as old as humanity itself, and that the path to recovery must include not just accountability for the deceiver, but compassion, restoration, and healing for the deceived.
Thank you for listening to this Scars Institute audiobook. We hope that you learned something meaningful, and that it helped you to find a connection between these ancient struggles and what scam victims experience today. Remember, this was not your fault. You are a survivor. You are stronger than you know. You are not alone. You are worthy. Learn to heal, rebuild, and thrive, and the Scars Institute can help you if you will let us. You have to make the choice to commit to your recovery and healing. We are here to help you. Begin by learning what you need to know now. Visit www.scamvictimsupport.org. We also invite you to enroll in our free Scars Institute Scam Survivor School. It is free for scam victim survivors and their families. To enroll in our next class, visit www.scarseducation.org. You should also explore all of the Scars Institute websites to expand your knowledge and find beneficial resources that can help you to recover from these terrible crimes. Remember, all Scars Institute services are free for all scam victim survivors and their families. The Scars Institute is a non-profit organization based in Miami, Florida, USA, with offices in the United States, in Monterrey, Nuevo Leon, Mexico, for Spanish speakers, and our European base in Poland. We hope that we have been of service, and we look forward to helping you further.